All right, so that's our overview. That's the sense of where we're going. So let's talk a little bit about why I wanted to teach this class. The first is it just seemed like a really appropriate class to start in mid-April, which is when it was originally scheduled for, right after Easter. It was a great time for us to explore the narratives and the concepts around Jesus's resurrection. And so the seasonal thing just seemed really appropriate and really great. But of course, COVID happened, and so I'm starting a couple weeks later than I was planning. But we're still technically in the liturgical season. Rob may correct me on this later. Send me a text, Rob, if I'm wrong. We're still in the season of Eastertide. We're still in the season of remembering the resurrection, of thinking about the resurrection. And so it's still appropriate. The second reason is that the resurrection, I am correct. Thanks, Rob. The resurrection is central to the New Testament. We could look at the 27 writings of the New Testament, and almost all of them, James is maybe the one major exception, the book of James, but all of the other writings of the New Testament are pretty straightforward about the resurrection, and so it's a central concept. It's central to what the church has said about Jesus. It's also central to what the church has said about believers and about what happens to us as believers after we die. And then the third thing that I really wanted to address is what does it mean for us today? Let me say in the first place that this is not going to be a class where I'm either uber apologetic in the sense of I'm trying to defend, every aspect of a literal, rendering of the resurrection of the body, nor is it an attempt to sort of tear that down. It is really just an attempt to examine what do these texts, what do the New Testament writings, what do they say about resurrection, and what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us as a people of faith? And can we wrestle with some of the complexities of the New Testament and the biblical witness to the resurrection? So that's really the sort of animating questions for me. What I'm curious for you all, and this is the first opportunity for you all to interact with me via text or via chat box, is I'm real curious to know what gets you in the room tonight, and assuming that hopefully, God willing, you'll be with me for the next several weeks. What do you hope to learn from a class like this one, and what questions do you have? So what do you either hope to learn, or what questions do you have? And just go ahead, again, in the chat box. You should be able to find it. It's a little dialogue box. Just think about it, and maybe the first thing that comes to mind, I don't need an essay, but just maybe some of the animating questions, and I'll mark these down as something to sort of bring back in future weeks. Good. I see some of y'all typing, so I'm waiting. Great. Lorraine says, I come because I want to stay connected, continue to search and learn with others. Great reason. Thanks, Lorraine, for sharing that. All right. Continue to think about this and add. I'm watching the chat as I go, and we can continue to add these questions or these reasons as we go. Right, Paul. Always Reformed theology, Paul. You're going to keep me on my toes. What are the benefits of Jesus's resurrection in Reformed theology? Who's resurrected? Do we all resurrect? Is Christianity based on a literal resurrection? Florida asks. Mariana, I participated in a class you taught and you learned and learned a lot and want to repeat that experience. Okay, we'll try. That's high expectations. I'm sure we'll learn something in this class. That's great. We'll keep those thoughts coming as we move on to the next part. So this is something that I have stolen whole cloth. Well, not the content, but the concept. I've stolen whole cloth from a great Old Testament teacher, Brent Strawn, who for a number of years taught at Candler School of Theology and then Duke Divinity School. Straight plucked him from Atlanta and moved him to North Carolina. But he introduced me to this concept of four, and it comes from pedagogy, the study of teaching and learning, and says that we can kind of hold on to things when they're presented in fours. And so I'm going to present four things about death in the Old Testament. And these are not the only things that could be said about death in the Old Testament, but there are at least four that I think are important. And I want to say that this book, and I'm going to share this book at the end, but it's called The Death of Death by Neil Gilman, Resurrection and Immortality in Jewish Thought. A chapter from this book has been immensely helpful as I prepared for tonight's class. And so, like I said, I'll share that book information on the back end. So let me say what the four on death are, and then we'll sort of talk about each one of those with some samplings of the Old Testament, some samplings from the Old Testament passages themselves. So death, in my perspective, in my attempt to sort of boil it down, the four things we're going to talk about is that death is natural, death is final, death is tragic, and death is dangerous. And these four concepts will really set up a good foundation for us as we begin to think about the resurrection and begin to think about the development of resurrection thought. So here we go with the first one. Death is natural. I could have called this passage the Verl Holmes quotation because my dad loves Ecclesiastes and he loves this passage in particular from Ecclesiastes, and it seems appropriate during a sermon series called the Wisdom Collaborative that we start with a wisdom text, Ecclesiastes. And so this is what Ecclesiastes says: for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate. So what Ecclesiastes in this list, this poetic list of these binaries, some of these we might say are more volitional, right? We can choose to be loving or hating. We can choose to seek and we can choose to lose. But others are less volitional. And the first one is really not, it's not a volitional decision all the time. Certainly a time to be born is not a choice that I made. It just sort of happened to me by the miracle of life. And then a time to die. But what the author of Ecclesiastes does here is frames it. It frames it in, this is normal. This is just a part of life. It's a cycle of life. You're going to be born and you're going to die. So it's a very natural process to the author of Ecclesiastes. Here's another version from Psalm 90, verses 10 and 12. The days of our life are 70 years, or perhaps 80 if we are strong. Even then their span is only toil and trouble. They are gone soon, and we fly away. So teach us to count our days, that we may gain a wise heart. So again, the author here, the psalmist here, speaks to the reality of death, that there is a limit to it. Maybe 70 years, maybe 80 years if we live a good life. and then with a pessimism perhaps that comes with life, and even that is just all hard work. I was almost hesitant to put this verse on the screen because it ends. Verse 10 says, "And we fly away." And for some of you in the class today, you might be thinking, well, that's it. That's the resurrection. Isn't that exactly what we say at funerals and when we understand death, that people die and their soul sort of flies up to some ethereal place? I think most biblical scholars, most Old Testament scholars, wouldn't see this as a reference to the resurrection, and I'll be able to support that in just a little bit. But at the very least, what the psalmist is saying is that life is limited, and because it's limited, we need to live with a wisdom perspective. We need to live wisely and count our days. Teach us to number our days. Teach us to be aware of the sort of the limit of our days, I think is what the psalmist is saying. Here's another series of verses, and what I've done, I'm not going to read all of them, but hopefully the color is showing up okay on your screen, where there's some red that I'm highlighting. And each of these verses, the ones from Job 34, from Psalm 146, and from Ecclesiastes 12, in my opinion, are all playing on this really powerful idea that we get from Genesis 2, which is in the bottom right corner of the screen, where the text reads that the Lord formed man, human, from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. A very poetic, symbolic understanding of the creation of humanity, that God gathers this dust from the earth, this dust creature, this dusty creature, and by breathing God's breath, and in Hebrew the word for breath is the same word for spirit or wind, and so God breathes into this clay creature, and it becomes a living being. And so what we find in the Hebrew Bible is there's riffs on this, that what happens when you die, when a person dies, is that life-giving spirit leaves their body, it returns maybe to God, and they return to the dust, right? And so you can see in Psalm 146, verse 4, when their breath departs, they return to the earth. The idea of the breath inside of us being a result of God's animating spirit, that when we breathe our last breath, that's it. All of these verses are pretty clear that when you breathe that last breath, where do you go? You go back to the dust from which you were formed. We all know the saying from dust to dust, ashes to ashes, right? And so each of these four passages in their own way speak to this reality of when the breath leaves our body, we return to the dust. And so each of these verses in their own way represents that death is natural, that there is a season for dying. There is a time when every single person will die. That life is limited, and therefore we need to learn to number our days. And that there's this beautiful, powerful, poignant image of the last breath being expired and returning, and then returning to dust. And so to say that the Old Testament says that death is natural is not to say that there's no room for death being untimely or tragic, but in the perspective of the authors of much of the Old Testament, death is just a reality. It's inevitable, and so we see that. The second thing that I want to say, the second part of death in the Old Testament, is that death is final. There is a finality to death in much of the Old Testament writings. And so this is a beautiful image from Job 14, verses 1 through 2, and then 7 through 10, where it opens and it says, a mortal born of woman, few of days and full of trouble, comes up like a flower and withers. flees like a shadow and does not last. And it goes on in verses 3 through 6 to talk about sort of the toil and the hardship of life. But then at the end of this passage makes this beautiful comparison between what a human has and what a tree has. And so in 7, it continues, "For there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoot will not cease. Though its root grows old in the earth and its stump dies in the ground, yet at the scent of water it will bud and put forth branches like a young plant. But mortals die and are laid low. Humans expire. And where are they?" Job is representing here the finality of death, that even a tree experiences something like what we might call resurrection, or certainly reincarnation, in its ability to be planted and to be cut down, but then to continue to grow and sprout in another form because of its root system, because of its ability to sort of grow up in that way. But that for humans, they die, and that's it. Job says that's kind of the end. And so we see a similar perspective of the finality of death. Here I've just given you a selection of the forefathers and foremothers of Israel who, you know what, all of them died. Whether we talk about Sarah or Abraham or Joseph or even Moses, the texts are very clear that they died. And many of the texts demonstrate a significant interest, not in what Moses is doing up in heaven today, but where Moses's gravesite is. Where are Moses's bones? And you may remember this about Joseph. When he dies, he says, "I need you to move my bones, place them with my ancestors." I think it's Joseph. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. But it's this idea, we see it in Deuteronomy 34, that it says, "Then Moses died. He was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, but no one knows his burial place to this day." So there's a finality to death, even represented in the forebearers of the faith, of Israel's faith. Here, we see other versions of this finality of death from Isaiah and the Psalms. This is from Isaiah 38. "For Sheol cannot thank you, death cannot praise you. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. The living, they thank you, as I do this day. Fathers make known to children your faithfulness." And Isaiah and Psalm 30, but other lament psalms make it very clear that death for them is the end of relationship. It's the end of relationship, not just with human beings, but in their perspective, it's also the end of relationship with God. And so we see in some of the lament psalms this refrain: "Can the dead praise you? Can the dead give you praise?" And the answer for the psalmist is no. Once I'm dead, my lips can't give you praise anymore. And so they're speaking this as a way of motivating God to act. They're saying, "God, save me from this danger. Save me from the threats to my life, so that I can continue going on praising you, continue going on being in relationship with you. Because if I die, that's it. That's the end of relationship. I'm cut off from you." And so there's a brutal sort of honesty about what death means for some of these biblical texts. So death is final, and if I was to sum it up, I would say that humans expire. That verse from Job is very poignant. That Israel's fathers and mothers have died, and that death, one of the really real aspects of the finality of death in the Old Testament is that it is the end of a relationship. An end of an active relationship. And I realize that we could have a discussion here about how the memory of the dead lives on in the living. And certainly in Israel's sacred traditions, that's the case. Moses's life has expired, but the memory of Moses lives on. But several of these texts in the Old Testament just emphasize this finality, that there's a break when a person experiences death. The third part of the four on death in the Old Testament is that death is tragic, or death can be tragic, would be maybe another way to say it. And we've already heard mention in Isaiah 38, which I just read, this idea of Sheol and the pit. And some of you are familiar with this because you read your Psalms. Essentially, these are places where the dead go. This is the place where the dead go. And we might talk about it as the netherworld, or the bowels of the earth, or the pit. But often, especially in the lament psalms, it is a symbol of a tragic and an untimely death. And so oftentimes, I think it's Job 5, or that depicts Sheol as a ravenous beast that is pursuing people, that people need to be protected from, because it's just on the move. And I'll just say, I think that if we were to sort of take a rabbit trail and ask the question, is Sheol the same thing as our understanding of hell, right? Our understanding of hell, sort of the common notion of hell. Maybe it's not even, a red dude with a tail and a pitchfork, but this idea that there is this place where people are tormented and punished eternally for their misgivings or for their sins. So is that what Sheol is? And I think that, generally speaking, in the Old Testament, I think that's a big jump for us to make. And we can talk about this later as the class goes on. But really, what Sheol and the pit are is they're just that symbol of that finality of death. They're that symbol of life that won't go on. We might consider them as a void or a null. But where we get this idea, and I don't know if I want to go to an intellectual sparring battle with this, but I would say that contemporary Christianity's understanding of hell owes much more to reception of Dante's Inferno than it does to reading of the Bible. That we have this in our imagination, our popular imagination, this view of torment and suffering. And yeah, Rob Spart says, and also Milton, has more to do with creative interpretations of maybe these biblical texts than of the Bible themselves. So death is tragic, and death is often related to this idea of Sheol in the pit. And so if you have your Bible, you're welcome to look at Isaiah chapter 38, verses 9 through 20. And this is an example of how, even though the Old Testament can affirm that death is totally natural, it can also, in the lament psalms and in other places, speak of it as tragic, as something that should be avoided. And so this is Hezekiah's, one of the kings of Israel's prayer. And it's a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer of gratitude that he utters after he had recovered from a sickness, which was most likely a mortal sickness. And he says in verse 10 that he had been consigned to the gates of Sheol. And the way that I read that, the way that I understand that, is that he is almost to enter. He's near the gates of Sheol. He hasn't entered in yet. He hasn't died yet, but he's about to enter into that place, into that pit, into that netherworld, into that null. And in verse 11, he's very clear that if that happens, it's the end of his relationship. It's the end of his relationship with God and with humanity. And he says then in verse 17, in praise, but you, God, you have held back my life from the pit of destruction. You have kept me from entering into that tragedy, into that death. And in Hezekiah's mind, dying at that time of that sickness would have been an early death. It would have been an untimely death. And so that's the reason he can regard the prolongation of his life as a blessing, and regard death as more tragic in its symbol. I've already mentioned in the Psalms of Lament that Sheol, or death, is often used as a symbol. In Psalm 88, he says, the psalmist says, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand." There's a finality, and there's, for the psalmist here, a symbol of, please bring me back from this place. Of course, the psalmist here is not speaking from beyond the grave, but is speaking more symbolically about what the grave means, about what the pit means, and is asking for deliverance, is asking for redemption. So what we see in this third part of the four is that death is tragic, and that the image, or the symbol of Sheol, really symbolize this absence of life, this finality, this cutoff from a relationship with God and with others. And that we see in the Psalms and in Hezekiah's prayer that people are trying to avoid death because it would have been viewed as an early death. And what we get that I think is really important for later development, later thinking about the resurrection, is this ridiculous trust, this assured trust that God can rescue the living from the threat of death. The Psalms of lament, the reason they can lament, the reason they can cry out, is because they are convinced that God can actually do something, that God can actually rescue them. And so they appeal to God's power to put a block in front of death and prevent death, so that the life can be spared. Now, I hope you're already beginning to think about how it's not a very far step to go from that conviction, God can save me from the threat of death, to the next conviction, God can save me from death. God can raise me from death, to getting into resurrection thinking. But this here, God can rescue the living from the dead, is the first step. The last thing that I want to say, and this is far briefer, is that the Old Testament gives us the idea that death is dangerous. And the first is, if we just were to think about the ritual around the dead, that is found in Leviticus and Numbers, there's a great concern that you don't want to be in close contact or close proximity with those who have died. They are a source of ritual impurity. And so, and even in contemporary Jewish practices, those who die, their bodies are prepared quite quickly for their funeral, for their service. And so the idea that a dead person is ritually impure suggests that death itself is dangerous. And then along with that is a fascinating set of texts in the Old Testament that warn against consulting those that would be able to summon the spirits of the dead. And so this is the $10,000 word for today is necromancy. You can just bring it up in casual conversation that you're doing your best in COVID to avoid necromancy. That Chris Holmes told you it was a bad thing, that the Bible says it's a bad thing, and that you're doing your best to avoid necromancy. And what necromancy is simply sort of the sort of, we could call them magical, others would call them religious practices that were meant to connect the living with the spirits of the dead. And this happens, continues to happen in we can see it in popular culture, whether we think of Ouija boards or whatever else. But there's this belief that the spirits of dead people are able to be summoned. And they're often summoned, the way that they're talked about being summoned is from a sleep or from this null place. And the Bible, at least the Old Testament, is pretty clear in warning against this. There's a pretty clear warning against this. there's a really interesting story in 1 Samuel 28 where the king Saul is desperate for some advice. And so he gets him some folks that can help, some people who specialize in necromancy, and they summon the spirit of Samuel who had died. They summoned Samuel, and Samuel's like kind of bent out of shape about it, to be frank. And it's so we have this image that this dividing line between the living and the dead is something that we really need to be careful to protect. And that to break that line is putting yourself at risk or your community at risk. So I've covered a lot of ground, and what I want to take is I just want to take 1 minute to reflect on a question to yourself, right? Just silent reflection. It gives you a sense to pause and think through what I've just conveyed. And that is, what about this survey of death in the Old Testament has surprised you? That's one part of the question. Or another part would be, how does it relate to your own experience or understanding of death? And again, this is really just a free writing exercise. So we've talked about death is natural, death is final, death is tragic, and death is dangerous. So just think through a little bit of what we've talked about and write your thoughts here about it. And maybe that'll prompt some questions as we approach the end. I'm going to give you 1 minute. All right, feel free to continue to jot down those thoughts or think about those. We're gonna turn the corner on our time tonight. We're approaching 8:12 right now, so I'm gonna wrap up, and then there'll be some time for questions. And I'm going to end with this question, and it's a provocative question. It's intentionally provocative because I want you to come back next week and learn more with me. So, it's total a bait and switch here. But the question is resurrection in the Old Testament? And the short answer, I think, based on the research that I've done is not really. At least not in the way that we find it in the New Testament, in the robust and diverse understandings of the resurrection that we find in the New Testament. It's just very difficult to see that connection. And so, as I said earlier, that death is inevitable, it's final. This is the consistent view of the Old Testament. There are exceptions, however, that prove the rule. And so everyone in the Old Testament dies except for two people, and you may know these two people. These are Enoch and Elijah. We know precious little about Enoch other than the very little that is said about him in Genesis 5. But what we learn is that he lived a full 365 years, most likely a symbolic number of a full life, a very full life. And then at the end of verse 24, it says, then he was no more because God took him. And subsequent Jewish literature is fascinated with this idea that God took Enoch. Not that he died, but that Enoch was taken. And so this led to the belief quite early after the Old Testament was written that Enoch actually somehow escaped death. And so we'll talk more about Enoch in future weeks. Similar story with Elijah that is more familiar. We know a lot more about the prophet Elijah, but in 2 Kings 2, we have this story. We're expecting Elijah maybe to die. He's sort of getting old. He's kind of ready to give up the ghost. But instead of dying, he is sort of whipped up in a whirlwind of two chariots and taken into heaven. And so again, there's this picture that Elijah is now in the dwelling place of God, and that Elijah didn't die. But other than Enoch and Elijah, everyone in the Old Testament experiences death eventually. Even the psalmists who pray to God, deliver me from Sheol, eventually go to Sheol at some point in their lives, whether long or short after that prayer. So then another way to put it is that if we were to look at Deuteronomy 11 or 28, there's a deep focus on this worldly rewards and punishments. That obedience to God is rewarded not with eternal life of blessing and favor, but it's given in the form of long life or physical blessings or economic blessings. And likewise, that disobedience to God is not meted out in an end of world scenario or in a place called hell, but punishment is meted out in disasters or destruction or in lack of blessings. And so one of the things that the Old Testament gives us is that only God is immortal. That seems to be one of the things that is in the water is it would be nearing blasphemous maybe for some of our authors to say, well, humanity can also be immortal, can also experience eternal life, because that is a quality true only to God. So there are two exceptions, two textual exceptions that prove the rule. And these will be the subject of our conversation next week that will push us into some other non-canonical Jewish literature. But this is where the idea of resurrection seems to have originated. The first is from Daniel 12 that talks about those who sleep, likely a euphemism for those who are dead, that they will awake, that they will be resurrected to everlasting life. And then in Isaiah 24 through 27, this is called the Apocalypse of Isaiah. That there's language that God will destroy or swallow up death itself. Death will be no more. And mentions that the dead shall live and corpses shall arise. That's 26:19. But these two texts, or these few verses, are really the only places in the Old Testament where we begin to see thinking along the lines of resurrection. And here it's even very limited, as we'll see in coming weeks. So come back next week to learn more about these expectations and how these expectations are picked up in other intertestamental or the literature between the Old Testament and the New Testament that was written by Jewish authors, to see how we get then to some more robust understanding of the resurrection. We have a good bit of time, 13 minutes, 12 minutes for questions and discussion. Rob Sparks has already asked a first question in the comments to me, and his question is Babylonian influences on eschatology. I think in reference to Isaiah and Daniel. And while Babylonian is possible, I think most people would point the finger at Persian influences. That we begin to see some cultural interaction among the Israelites and Persians that lead to these sorts of thinking. But we'll get there next week. Don't steal my thunder, Reverend Sparks. So what other questions are there? Feel free at this point. I'm gonna go ahead and, as I said, I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording. So for those of you who have been watching remotely, thank you. Come back next week.